Hello everybody, it's Dr. Greg Barston, and today's first class on cardiovascular disease is entitled Know Your Risks and Beat the Odds. The following statements have not been evaluated by the FDA and they're not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease, just as a disclaimer. So the goals for this class, we're going to define heart and cardiovascular disease, really what it is, the current standard of care problems, we're going to get into detail on that, what is heart disease risk, what causes heart disease, and then measuring your individual risks. And then class number 2, we'll talk about some natural support options. So heart disease risk, we're getting into the definitions, and there's many types of cardiovascular disease, including myocardial infarction, also known as heart attacks. There's angina pectoris, which is also known as the classic crushing chest pain with pain going down the arm, especially upon exertion. There's heart failure. There's stroke, which is basically almost like a mini heart attack in the brain, and there's hypertension. Cardiovascular disease, or CVD as we'll call it, is the #1 killer in the world and in the United States, just ahead of cancer. And the lifetime risk for cardiovascular disease is 2 in every 3 for men and 1 in 2 for women. And this is from the ongoing Framingham Heart Study. Now, some of these statistics are a bit older. Some of them are 5 to 10 years old, but the statistics are still relatively the same, which is why I chose to keep these in here and not update them. About 795,000 strokes a year in the United States, which means there's about 1 every 40 seconds somebody's having one. So that's big from a stroke standpoint. And about 16.5, almost 17 million people alive today have a history of heart attacks or angina. Over 1 million Americans will have a new or recurrent one, and as of 2009, there's about 2,600 deaths a day in the United States just from cardiovascular disease alone. That's about 1 every 35 seconds. So that's pretty sobering. So what is it? Is it heart attacks? Is it strokes? Is it angina? And you guys can go back and always review these cartoons in here if you'd like to, or some more details. So feel free to go back and review as much as you'd like. But the basic concept here is heart attacks and strokes. We'll talk about this first of all. Blood carrying the oxygen, which is vital for all the functions in the body, and without it, the cells begin to die irreversibly within a few minutes. And the complications of heart disease, heart attacks, strokes, angina, basically are based on that same basic concept, is that there's lack of oxygen to the target tissue. Oftentimes happens from a plaque buildup or atherosclerosis. So there's a few different forms. One of them is the heart attack, where there's plaque builds up in the diameter of the arteries. It's feeding blood to the heart. And a rupture of one of those plaques is basically what blocks the blood flow to the portion of the muscle, and it dies. A stroke is very similar, except the blockage occurs inside the brain. There's also congestive heart failure, which is a progressive weakening of the heart where the motor's not able to pump efficiently. Angina we talked about. There's also heart valve problems, which is there's either congenital, which means from birth, or an acquired defect, oftentimes from a toxin or a chemical or a virus. The list of those potential causes is still unknown, but it's growing. Electrical signaling problems. Here's where we get into arrhythmias and palpitations and so forth. But for this class, we're really going to be focusing on heart attacks and the specific risk factors as it relates to strokes, and also atherosclerosis, which is the building up of plaque, and angina. So the standard of care, which we're going to be really focusing on and kind of picking a bone with here, is really concerned with cholesterol. And the standard of care, the primary goal is to have cholesterol below 200 milligrams per deciliter, and that's based on blood. Even there's some pending legislation, at least at the time of this presentation, this is near the end of 2014, where they're going to try to, the powers that be, that is, bring the cholesterol levels down below 180. Very difficult to do that on a lot of folks in there without a medication involved in here. So you have to wonder where the motivation of that is coming from, because it's certainly not based on science. Lots of good cholesterol, which is, you want that in the 45 to 50 range or higher, and low bad cholesterol, also known as the LDL. We want that below 100. It used to be below 130, but some labs have it below 100 now. And the primary strategy is we're using diet, exercise, and basically statin-based drugs. And our question that we're posing is this simplistic approach sufficient? We'll talk about that. And first of all, let's lead off with a pretty bold quote here through the National Heart, Blood, and Lung Institute. Basically, 50% or half of all heart attack victims had normal cholesterol. So that really begs the question, how well does cholesterol assess cardiovascular risk? I mean, ultimately, most people are always thinking of the fact of, well, we need to lower cholesterol, but most studies show that lowering cholesterol has proven benefits. Okay. But other studies show that overall mortality, meaning death, changes very little with cholesterol-lowering medicines. However, There's several other important factors we need to talk about, such as systemic inflammation, free radical damage to fats, also known as lipid peroxides, sticky blood, chronic low-level infection, and the quality of fats that we consume. There's some references down at the bottom. So let's talk about statin drug therapy to kick it off here. These are classified as what's called an HMG-CoA reductase inhibitor. Fancy name, but it basically reduces the production of cholesterol, which occurs in the liver. It blocks an enzyme, though, also involved with energy production. And here's some examples of some of these statin-based drugs. Anytime you see something with the word statin in it, they work on very similar mechanisms, and there's a lot of different specific drugs that will do that based on their patents, but they all do variations of the same thing. Now, there's heart disease risk we want to talk about. Now, there's something called a relative versus absolute risk, and this is very misleading when it comes to statins. When you hear about studies or doctors that talk about, well, statins will reduce your risk, we really have to get into the statistics here. And there's something in statistical analysis called NNT. It means the numbers needed to treat. Number needed to treat. How many people needed to be treated in order for just one to benefit? And you always want to ask a prescribing doctor this. How many people were treated in the study that you're referring to in order for one person to benefit, or called the NNT? A classic example is the landmark Jupiter study, and this was for primary prevention in men over 50 and women over 60 with LDL. This is the bad level of cholesterol, less than 130, but a CRP, which we'll talk to. Now hang in there. CRP stands for C-reactive protein, which is an inflammation marker. And we don't want that higher than 1, but in this particular study, they had it higher than 2. It did show decreased events or heart attacks with Crestor, which is a statin-based drug. But, and this is what the media did not pick up on, the numbers needed to treat was 240. So what that means to you and I is that with the drug companies, when they were designing this and they got the information back from the study, 239 people had to be treated in order for just one to benefit. However, the media, in their usual spin doctor way of things, concluded that statins were effective. And the new evidence showed lowering CRP. This is an interesting thing. New evidence is really saying this. Even if you just lower the CRP without touching the bad cholesterol, you'll still have lower amounts of cardiovascular events. So an interesting question here is, why not measure everyone at risk for this CRP molecule if that was really one of the big things that was studied here that found was fairly important? Well, the standard view is interesting also because when it comes to statins, besides rare increased muscle and liver enzymes, and you see this on a basic blood chemistry panel, that the statins are relatively safe. Well, there's an updated view now, and we know that statins basically deplete the body's level of coenzyme Q10. Now, this is something that's found in every cell of our body, but especially in the gums and the heart muscle, and it's responsible for producing energy. And when this is depleted from statins, it increases risks of cancer and neuropathy. Neuropathy is the tingling and numbness and all this kind of stuff. So it's an interesting thing. How come people aren't being told about this? And it's another thing as we move on to heart disease risk. An important fact is that statins also can decrease brain function, poor memory, Parkinson's, dementia, Alzheimer's. These are all attributable to statins, and there's at least there's some controversy over this. So some long-term studies are really going to be needed, but these are some docs that talk about this that are needed. So heart disease risk, is it really the enemy? Well, cholesterol is needed as a necessary component of all cells and membranes in the body. And they're a product of producing testosterone and progesterone and estrogen, vitamin D, our brain molecules. The brain is actually 10 to 20% weight of cholesterol. Two sources of cholesterol, a little bit's from the diet, but most of it's from the liver. And even vegetarians produce 500 to 1,500 milligrams per day, but it's only found in animal products for the most part. So there's many natural compounds that can reduce cardiovascular disease more safely, cheaply, and possibly safer than effective and expensive statin drugs. We'll get into that a little bit more in class number 2. But a little Q&A here. Is it accurate to say that the lower the cholesterol, the better? And the answer is no. In fact, some research shows that cholesterol below 140 has an increased stroke risk. In fact, those references that I talked about in the earlier slide mention that too. And are there any long-term risks with very low cholesterol level? Well, endocrinology, or the science of hormones, tells us that when cholesterol is below 140, we're really not efficiently making sex hormones anymore. So low levels of testosterone and estrogen, this is why this is important, is associated with coronary artery disease risk. So if we're not making much of the good hormones because we're on a statin drug and or because our cholesterol is too low, that's a cardiac risk. People aren't told this. So some other misconceptions. Well, fat is fat. That's not true. Central obesity, which is the chunk of fat around our midriff, the heavy midline, it's very active. It's more than just a bag of extra calories there. Those fat cells around our midline secrete powerful inflammation molecules and bump our risk up. Another standard view is all saturated fat is bad and it makes plaque, and that's absolutely not true. It's not science. It's a really an outdated hypothesis, and plaque actually contains, interestingly enough, no saturated fat. Really good book on the subject is by Gary Taubes called Good Calories and Bad Calories. He's also got another one that's out. It's a little bit more layman friendly. It's called Why We Get Fat. I would encourage people to look at either one of those, as well as Udo Erasmus's book, Fats That Heal and Fats That Kill. Some other misconceptions, well, my stuff is genetic and I can't change it. We know that's not true because 80% of cardiovascular disease now, we know it's environment and diet. Only about 20% or a small percentage is genetic. You can measure the cardiovascular risk easily by using an expanded lipid profile testing of LPA. And if LP little a is elevated, this is a marker now to find out if you have genes or not. A lot of people say, oh, I've tried exercise, I tried lowering my fat. It doesn't do anything. It must be genetic because my mom or my brother or my sister or my grandma or whatever had it. You'll know that by testing LPA. Now, there's other genetic markers too, but this is the most widely known, which is what we're focusing on here in this particular presentation. So it doesn't really have anything to do with your height, your weight, or anything else. It's in the genes. So LPA, it's a small plaque-forming dense LDL particle. It's one of those bad guy cholesterols, and it's not routinely checked. If it's high risk, it is a genetic marker. And guess what? Statin drugs don't help it. Now, there's a lot of doctors out there with good intentions that are prescribing statin drugs, and they're not even finding out if it's a genetic. If it is a genetic situation where your cholesterol is high, then the statin drugs have no place. It also allows for individual therapy if you understand the genetic risks. We'll talk about that in class number 2. So what's the difference between HDL and LDL? Well, everybody knows that the HDL is quote-unquote the good guy, and LDL is the bad guy. It stands for LDL, which is the bad, stands for low-density lipoproteins. They deposit cholesterol in our pipes, and HDL, or the good stuff, is the high density, and they bring the cholesterol to the liver so the body can remove it. And there's other subcategories of both of these lipoproteins, basically a fat hooked up with a protein. It's a carrier molecule, and new testing methods to determine risks for cardiovascular disease, and that's really a lot of what this class is about. So the standard view is people with heart attacks must have high bad LDL cholesterol, and that's actually not true. According to the Framingham study, about half the people with a heart attack have normal LDL by current standards, and a large percent with increased LDL, or the bad guy cholesterol supposedly, never have a vascular event. So the question is, why are we told to control LDL as if it's the ultimate goal or the holy grail if it doesn't really correlate with much? Well, here's some other studies that talk about this as well. You can look at this as well. There's a lot of other studies that have come out in the meantime, but it is really a false sense of security that we're given. So LDL, the bad guy. Well, is it? Well, LDL functions as what I call a full dump truck. It's looking to unload cholesterol in our blood vessels. And LDL is really just a bulk measurement. The most important is, and here's the two things here, how is it packaged and is it oxidized? So let's look first at this packaging of the LDL particles. So their LDL is basically two types of LDL particles. There's large, light LDL particles. I call them soccer balls. And then there's small, dense LDL particles, and I call those marbles. Those are really the bad ones. So why? Well, the small, dense LDL particles, which you need to get expanded lipid profile testing to find this. A standard cholesterol panel will not test this, so you have to ask your doctor. Small, dense LDL particles easily pass through blood vessels that are damaged. It's called endothelium. That's where the plaque starts. We use the soccer net analogy. Can a soccer ball pass through the net? No, but marbles can. So they can get through there and start squirming around and start forming this atherosclerotic plaque. Here's an interesting fact that we'll touch on later. Insulin resistance, which has a lot to do with blood sugar problems, drives our particle size of these bad cholesterols down, and it increases their density. The perfect storm for starting cholesterol problems in terms of plaque. So the standard view is plaque is caused by excessive LDL, and the updated view we now know is plaque is found at the scene of the crime, but is not necessarily the culprit. So are there other risk factors? Well, yeah. The packaging of the LDL means its particle size and density is a better cardiac risk measurement than the numbers. So the worst plaque forming, I should say, LDL particles are LDL type 3 and LDL type 4. Now there's a variety of labs that won't name these necessarily LDL type 3 or 4. They might name them smaller LDL types or dense LDL types, but they're all pretty much the similar situation here where they're the bad guys. These types of LDL are the smallest and the most dense. This is going to be high risk. And note, this is big. Statins don't lower these or change the particle number. They only reduce the more fluffy types, the large soccer ball types of LDLs. That's the type 1 and 2. And those are the least problematic. So very interesting. So does it pose as a problem? Well, it really doesn't pose as a problem unless it's oxidized. And that oxidized cholesterol means that the cholesterol is sticky. If you have a lot of small, dense LDLs, which are the bad guys to start off with, and they're oxidized, they form free radicals. And this is the lipid peroxides. There's my little dramatic illustration of an atomic bomb thing in there, but that's kind of what they'll do in our arteries, and they start forming plaques. So HDL, is it the only good guy? Well, HDL is kind of an empty dump truck, and it's looking to take fats away. Just as LDL has different types, so does the HDL. Again, you need expanded profile lipid panel tests to pick this stuff up. And as an example, one of them is called HDL type 2B. It's one of the most protective of all the HDL types. So you can't just lump all your HDLs together and say, oh, well, my HDL is good, so I guess I'm okay. A lot of people with elevated HDL have very little of the protective portion of that. So again, it's a false sense of security. You need to find out. Triglycerides, which is the saturated fats in our blood. Well, high levels are, the standard view says high levels are no big deal unless you have pancreatitis, and we know that's not true. It's actually a great marker of metabolic syndrome, and it's actually more predictive of cardiovascular disease in women than anything else except C-reactive protein. And I just put a little note. No studies using statin drugs in women showed prolonged life or decreased risk of fatal MIs. It was good for non-fatal heart attacks, and that particular portion of that data has really been skewed where they say, well, this will stop heart attacks. But you know, the biggest thing that people worry about with heart attacks isn't are you going to have one, it's are you going to die from one. And as of now, the evidence shows very little, if no evidence to support that. So let's look at some other risk factors in through here, and this comes from the National Cholesterol Education Program. These are the new lipoprotein risk factors. There's another little particle, hang in there though, called RLPs. It stands for remnant lipoprotein. Remnants because they're kind of small. They're about high in 20% of the population, and these are very, very atherogenic. They form plaques at just a drop of a hat. It skips this, what we call oxidization part. We talked about the small, dense LDLs. These are the really big problems in through there. They got a 3 times greater risk of forming cardiovascular disease than those buoyant type LDLs. Those are the 1s and 2s. Why? Well, because they penetrate blood vessel linings in little tiny small micro cracks real easy and start forming plaque. LPA, we talked about that. That's also easily oxidized. That's a genetic marker. And then there's the good stuff in here. HDL type 2B and 3. This is low in about 20% of the population. Why is this a good guy? Well, it picks up excessive cholesterol. So the overwhelming science suggests that expanded cardiovascular testing is crucial. So questions, why isn't expanded testing used more often? Well, there's some researchers and some medical experts that I respect very well, including some well-known cardiologists that are best-selling authors that suggest that guidelines for cholesterol treatment are largely driven by drug company data. So there may be an inherent bias there. So let's talk about this, and let's be more specific on the causes of it. So the primary causes of cardiovascular disease, and this is based on a thorough review of the literature, but this presentation wasn't meant to be a thorough review of the PubMed research studies. It was just to kind of give you the salient points. We had to talk about blood vessel tone and flow problems. This has a lot to do with nitric oxide, the little miracle molecule that we're all supposed to make a lot of. Insulin resistance, which is blood sugar problems, oftentimes coming from wrong carbohydrates they were eating or too much sugars. Oxidized fats, trans fats, just wrong fats I call them. External and internal toxins, free radicals, infection, inflammation, which is kind of common with all of these factors, a sedentary lifestyle, stress, smoking, and genetics. So let's talk about nitric oxide for getting into the nitty-gritty here. And it's a compound basically made in the body, and it acts on a variety of tissues. And it's a chemical messenger, actually for immune functions and neurological functions as well. But predominantly what we're focused on here is blood vessel tone. It relaxes blood vessels. It opens them up. It can decrease blood pressure. It can escort more blood and oxygen to well-needed and tissues that are in dire need. Some drugs do work on nitric oxide-related mechanisms to relax this stuff. It's called endothelial relaxation, but in targeted areas. For example, Cialis and Viagra. In excess, though, it can be toxic. It's like a lot of things in life. It's a good news, bad news. You want to have a balance. But a deficiency can contribute to vascular constriction, which is what plaque does as well. We'll get into a little bit more details on that in class 2. So some other stuff, we're going to talk about syndrome X, or what's now referred to later as metabolic syndrome, originally described by Gerald Raven, who's an endocrinologist at Stanford University. And he discovered that the overconsumption of poor metabolism of refined carbohydrates basically contributes greatly to many disease processes, including cardiovascular disease. Now, I'm oversimplifying this, but this is something that should be on the lips of every single physician on the planet, is metabolic syndrome, or at least looking for this with people at risk. Why is this important? Well, Let's talk about hundreds and hundreds of sodas with high fructose corn syrups available today. This is a big problem. Why? Well, it causes a spike in insulin, which is that blood sugar regulating hormone, and ultimately results in insulin resistance. Now, normally insulin grabs sugar and chaperones it into the cell. When we build up insulin resistance, the receptors become blocked. The glucose molecules can't attach to the receptor and be brought into the cell, like that graphic on the right will show here. And so what happens is the sugar stays elevated in the blood, the body forms more triglycerides. It also drives the particle size down of some of those bad cholesterol molecules we talked about. So yeah, believe it or not, sugar, high fructose corn syrup, all this insulin resistant stuff we're going to be mentioning is a direct cause with cardiovascular disease, or a direct risk. So is this you? Insulin resistant. It can lead to fatigue and constant hunger, sugar cravings, sleepiness right after meals is a constant and a chronic and a common symptom that we see a lot of times. It can also drive hormone imbalances. And women, they get what's called polycystic ovarian syndrome sometimes. And it can also lead to estrogen dominance in men, as well as low thyroid problems in both men and women. The big thing is it creates increased fat storage and upper abdominal obesity. And this is what drives the problem. So here's a classic little graphic here that metabolic syndrome leads to hypertension, obesity, high blood sugar, high triglycerides. It drives those particles of the bad guys, those LDL particles, down. It makes them smaller and it makes them more denser, so they're worse risks. And it also lowers our good guys, our HDLs. So the hormone issues, I touched on it briefly, but in the normal guy, testosterone is cardioprotective to a degree. But that's our dominant hormone. In women, estrogen is the dominant one. But in metabolic syndrome, what happens in a male is it drives testosterone down and estrogen up. And that is one of the contributing factors of what we call andropause. This is a cardiac risk. Now in women, normally estrogen is very cardioprotective, and testosterone, is, if it's elevated, is a cardiac risk. And this is what happens in metabolic syndrome, and also to a degree in menopause, where estrogen drops and testosterone can go up. These are not good. So we want to try to keep the sugars and the fats, or rather the sugars and the carbs and the high glycemic foods that we'll talk about, down, because it can mess up the hormones, and the hormones can also mess up and contribute to cardiovascular stuff. So an excessive intake of refined starches greatly contribute to the whole process, not to mention just diabetes, which is a huge cardiovascular risk. And here we're talking about refined starches like bread, pasta, chips, fries, breakfast cereals, cookies, cakes, muffins, croissants, bagels. Crazy. It's the stuff that most everybody eats all the time now. So here's some low glycemic foods, and basically I like low glycemic or GI foods. This is based on the ability of the food to raise its blood sugar after consumption, and we're looking for lower numbers ideally. So you'll see the chickpeas at 39, lentils at 42, and beans and peas and things like that lower. When you get into things like white rice, white bread, potatoes, things like that, the numbers start getting high. So we generally want to try to eat from a lower glycemic list, and there are many lists that can be found easily online. Let's talk about some omega-3 fats as a contributor. Well, the standard view shows a meta-analysis, which is a review of a number of studies out there on cardiovascular stuff, shows that the best death rate reductions are from statin drug use. Well, that's not true. We know that fish oil reduces cardiovascular mortality better than statins, even when there's no change in the LDL. Possible reasons? Well, fish oil is anti-inflammatory. It lowers triglycerides. It keeps the platelets less sticky, and it lowers what we call our other adhesion or sticky molecules. And here's a question: shouldn't everyone at risk take fish oil? Well, that's a good debate. And shouldn't you know if enough omega-3 fats are in your cell membranes? One of our favorites is to do an omega-3 index test, and you can go to omegaquant.com. It's one of the most highly known peer-reviewed labs for testing omega-3s in the blood. Some people think they're eating enough, and they really don't. Some people don't think they eat enough, and they're probably doing too much. I would say that's less common, but blood and RBC, or red blood cell omega-3 fats, are considered by experts to be a significant tool in estimating cardiac risk, and the omega-3 index can be used to both analyze and monitor red blood cell omega-3 levels accurately. And a target range is usually around 6.5% or higher. Well, that's a big problem, because most standard Americans have 4% or less in their red blood cells. And if it's below 4%, you might want to consider some of these basic dosages and stuff in through there. And there's even been some expert opinion and some consensus saying that if you can get your level of your omega-3 index up 6.5%, even 8%, you can lower your risks of sudden cardiac death by up to 90%. And there's no drug that can do that. So this is an interesting concept in through here. Here's the omega-3 index risk reduction that I just mentioned. Now watch for careful of fish. We do know that there's omega-3s in fish, but these days, our world is becoming a more polluted place. Some of these tables can be found at the National Resource Defense Council.org, and some of these fish, though, are very high in toxics. And these fish, the larger predator fish specifically, will bioaccumulate mercury and PCBs and other pollutants and stuff. So you want to try to eat the foods that are less toxic and the ones that are lower in mercury in through there. So I would say that wild salmon is a good one as well. So, as one of my mentors, Dr. Robert Marshall, used to say, if you want the convenience of eating make-believe food, you're going to eventually get make-believe health. And so these foods are convenient, they taste good, they may be cheap, but they don't do our cells any good, which is ultimately all that cares. And this is no more true than in cardiovascular disease. So, to maximize good fat metabolism, let's say you're getting some better fish in or some other fats that we'll talk about more in class number 2. But there are good fat roadblocks, and these are including caffeine and alcohol, excessive sugar, insulin, trans fats. Basically, we want to have more good fat helpers that assist the metabolism of the good fat, making these good tissue hormones that we're trying to get. So magnesium, a little zinc, B6, vitamin C, these are all helpful things. So the gut-liver connection and inflammation. This is a big issue. Most people don't think about our digestion and our gut relating at all to inflammation. And inflammation is one of the primary drivers of cardiovascular disease wherever it comes from. So runaway inflammation or systemic inflammation can be due to a toxic bowel or liver. And we're not talking toxic bowel like this is a medical emergency. We're talking about sluggishness. Just most people are walking around what we call them the walking wounded. They're not bad enough to be formally diagnosed with a disease or condition, but yet they don't quite feel their best. This is where conventional medicine, as great as it screens predominantly for pathology. We're looking at functional weaknesses. Do you have chronic low-level digestive weaknesses? Do you have chronic low-level infection? Way too much non-steroidal anti-inflammatory abuses? Do you have an imbalance in your gut microflora from excessive uses of antibiotics? Is there food allergies or food intolerances? This is why this is a big deal, is over 70% of the immune system is actually in the gut. It's called gut-associated lymphoid tissue. So it's no wonder why so many people have this chronic low-level smoldering inflammation that they don't really realize where it's coming from. Gallbladder is a classic example. Over 700,000 of these removed every year in the United States. Why? Well, bad fats, bad eating, obesity, chronic infection, things like that. And you'll know that because it can lead to things like constipation, bloating, burping, abdominal pain. Right shoulder pain is a classic referral for that. Gas, things like that. So in our Learning Center, we've got some really good articles on this. You should check that out at our website there. So other causes of inflammation, major sources can include the smoldering effects of low-level toxins. We mentioned mercury, but there's also lead in the water and plastics and things like that. There's bisphenol A and phthalates. Personal care products are getting better. The companies are starting to self-police a little bit more when taking out the parabens and things like that. But there's also still a number of compounds that are found in there that shouldn't be because it's largely an unregulated industry. And that includes organochlorine compounds found in produce and public school. The list just keeps growing. Here's some other references on it. So what causes free radical damage? Again, we mentioned these oxidized fats. Well, poor diet, trans fats, white flour, sugar, excessive alcohol, caffeine. Why? Because they all create inflammation. Malabsorption, as well as some of these things we're talking about in here with weak elimination. People aren't pooping every day. Low antioxidant nutrient intake because of possibly poor soil quality or lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. Metabolic toxins, like some of these things we mentioned. And again, I talk about infection. This is something that really is starting to get a little bit more up above the radar. Free radicals destroy the normal function of fats and cholesterol. Why? Well, they oxidize their cell surface membrane and now they're incapable of regular duty. They get sticky. That's a big reason why the blood fats get sticky. Oxidized fats and cholesterol, we also call these lipid peroxides. I call these assassins of healthy blood flow. They need to be eliminated. There's no good amounts of them at all. So here's a classic example, like an example of what free radicals can do to paint on cars. There's a brand new paint job up on the upper left, and there's a crummy one down on the right with maybe the elements, maybe sun, UV exposure, maybe the elements of other types in through there. But this is kind of what happens with our cholesterol molecules when they become oxidized as well. They become basically useless. Here's a classic example of the poster kid for a free radical potential compound that can oxidize our fats. It's called homocysteine. first discovered by Kilmer McCulley at Harvard in 1969. Well, what is it? It's an amino acid metabolite made from methionine. It's just a basic normal friendly amino acid. It gets converted to cysteine and it gets recycled normally if we have adequate folic acid, B12, B6, and something called trimethylglycine. But if we're deficient in those nutrients, or we have inborn errors of metabolism, or even in a genetic defect, we can have homocysteine level that elevates, and the liver can't clear the toxins as well. So the upper reference range in some labs, most of them, talk about 11.5 for guys and about 10.5 for gals. But many experts, the ones that we respect and we really pay attention to, suggest that it should be in single digits, like 8 or less. So this is a big thing that you want to find on expanded lipid panel testings, because if your homocysteine is high and your blood cholesterol still is normal, you still have roughed up damaged fats. So dental infection, heart disease, well, this is a big issue. Dentists know this really commonly. I mean, you get someone with bad dental infection and you got to get on those antibiotics because some of these things can go to the heart valves and things like that. But this is just a classic thing. The gums are like a window into your physiology. And a lot of times if the gums are really bad, it often means that there's systemic inflammation in the blood vessels as well. There's some studies that show that. So this is plaque formation. It's really not a good thing to do or to have. Another one is mycoplasma. Well, what are they? It's kind of a species of bacterium, one of the smallest free-living organisms on the planet, and they share characteristics of bacteria and fungus, but unlike regular bacteria, mycoplasmas don't have a cell wall, so they're hard for the immune system to attack, and that's why we call them stealth pathogens. A classic example is Mycoplasma pneumonia, which has also been implicated in some cases of causing systemic inflammation and arterial plaque formation. There's a couple of references that support that. It's always important to get tested to verify if you got it. Blood antibody tests are revealing in most cases, not all. Some people just don't make antibodies to it, but it's still a good thing to have checked. Plaque culturing is the gold standard, but it's invasive and it's rarely done. Many natural and drug choices are available, but some have limited success. So we're going to look at possibly whole person and predisposing factors as in class number 2. Another cause is fibrinogen. This is also called the pipe clogger or the arterial clogger. It's a necessary protein made in your liver. It's a precursor for fibrin, which helps with clot formation. Here's the normal reference range. Ideally is around 200 to 300 though, and if it's excessive, it's a threat to normal blood flow. Why? Well, it's also a marker of inflammation and infection, but it definitely will hamper blood flow. It compromises the viscosity, makes the blood thicker. Imagine trying to suck molasses through a straw as opposed to water. You want your blood to flow really smoothly, very easily. Typical treatments involve things are centered around reducing inflammation and possibly infection. Don't take anything to reduce this, though, if you are on any blood thinning medications. And this is an scanning electron microscope of what fibrin looks like when it's in excessive amounts around the red blood cells. And so if there is infection, that creates inflammation. The inflammation drives fibrinogen, and then we get sticky and congested blood. Normally our body clears that out, but if we have excessive amounts, you want to do something about it. And so there's two big questions. How do we get plaque in our arteries, and are there easy ways to measure my risk? Well, here's just a basic foray. I'm going to go through this really quickly. You guys can always go through this and stuff, but it starts off, here's the inside part of the lumen of the arteries, and we have a monocyte, which is a type of a white blood cell. And then there's our LDL molecules, those quote-unquote bad guy fats. And they're not all bad, though, as we know. The type 3s and 4s, or those small, dense ones, are the worst. And you can see the different color sizes in through there. So the macrophage comes in, it mingles around with the dense type LDLs, then they get oxidized. That's where they form the red stuff there. Those get converted into something what's called a foam cell now. Foam cell engulfs all of these things in through. You notice how there's more of the small red dots in through there. That's the dense LDL particles. And then they form, that's what starts building the plaque formation. Now there's these remnant lipoproteins coming in the back door as well, and they come in and they can kind of contribute to the problem as well directly. So that's when we can oftentimes get like a rupture in the plaque formation, especially if we have some markers that will show that. So the National Cholesterol Education Program, the guidelines for cardiovascular disease, is 50% of at-risk individuals are not identified. Now this is something that's important, and this is something what all doctors need to pay attention to. This is why expanded lipid panel testing is absolutely critical if you're going to try to stem off or find if you're at risk of the biggest killer in the globe right now. 50% of heart attacks have normal cholesterol, so we need to find a new lipoprotein risk factors, and these new ones will help assess those at risk. So why get an expanded lipid panel test? Well, it's a better risk assessment. We're looking at lipoprotein particle numbers versus just the cholesterol content. I hope I've made that clear. We're looking at non-lipid risk factors, and this is something we haven't touched on too much. I didn't want to get into too much detail in this short webinar here, but there's something called LP-PLA. That's as kind of, for lack of a better choice of words, is really describing the vulnerability of our plaque. Is it susceptible for breaking off? There's LPA. That's that genetic marker. There's C-reactive protein, or CRP, the one that the Jupiter study used. That's a really big indicator marker of inflammation in the body. Insulin, we talked about that not being good when there's that metabolic syndrome or these problems with blood sugar. Homocysteine, a marker of free radical damage for our fats, and there's some others as well. So we need to you can go back and kind of check some of these. Some other risk factors are, fasting blood sugar at 95 or higher. Ideal is 75 to 90. Hemoglobin A1C is huge. You want this to be 5.5 or less. That's a marker of free radical damage to our blood sugar molecules as they're binding to hemoglobin. Fasting insulin levels should be ideally less than 6, although the reference range is usually 8 or less, but I like 6 or less. Some of them reference ranges even go up to 15, which is ridiculous. Fasting blood fats or triglycerides below 150. We usually like 70 to 130. If it's really high, could mean that you got insulin resistance or you're just simply eating way too many carbohydrates. This is a little complex slide, but I'm going to go over it briefly. You can come back and review this. From left to right, it goes from low risk to high risk. And if you look in the middle of the slide, all these people have the same cholesterol levels. They all have 125 milligrams per deciliter. That's patient A, B, C, and D, as you read from left to right. But there's a low risk when these particles, these LDL particles, are buoyant, and there's a high risk when they're really small. We talked about that. So can we measure other individual risks for heart disease? Well, the typical stuff measures cholesterol, which is total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, triglycerides. There's some other things in here as well. Glucose, hypertension is an easy thing to do, your family history and your gender. These are the red items that are routinely screened with conventional lipid panel tests. Now, in the blue stuff, we're looking at some things that are found with expanded lipid panel testing. Yes, you get the standard lipid panels, but you're also possibly getting that LPA, the genetic marker, the remnant lipoproteins, and some of those other things. So go back and check some of those things you want to make sure. So measuring your risks for lipid panels. These are fail to find usually many potential risks on a standard stuff. So if this car represents standard lipids in your vessel, or you're really getting the full picture. So let's say that car just represents a standard lipid panel. And you say, wow, everything looks really good there. But the following slide shows us what happens when you get an expanded lipid panel. So you got a lot of other fats and some other damage and some drams and all kinds of junk going on and through there. And so you really were possibly given a false sense of security there. And so this shows the value of really getting more information from a broader scope. So cholesterol is like fire. It's often mistaken as bad when viewed with a limited perspective. But sometimes it's not. It's just a good old-fashioned campfire here. And so this is why a lot of people have higher lipid levels in through there, but when they find that they have expanded panels done and all these other heavier risk factors are done, they really don't see that much going on in through there. So it's a really nice thing to have done. Here's some text that I've seen and that I've read, and there's other ones out there. My gosh, I could fill 10 slides with recommended books on here, but these are just some ones to get you closing up. Cardiovascular disease, what's your blood vessel tone? Well, we talked about that with a little bit with nitric oxide. Do you have insulin resistance? Are you eating wrong fats and carbs? What about toxins and infection and inflammation? But you got sticky, small, dense, damaged fats. And do you have a genetic marker? If none of these things were tested, these are the things that most of these really good quality expanded lipid panel tests can do. So the current standard of care may be inadequate. We're concluding here. Standard tests miss a lot of these things, and expanded testing gets them. So labs and their tests can include, and there's a variety of these lab profiles. I'm not tied to any one particular lab. I've used several of these and I like them all. You just have to go through and find out which one, along with your doctor or your licensed health practitioner, fits your needs. SpectraCell Labs has got a great one, their LPP+. The cholesterol balance test by Boston Heart Diagnostics is also great, and there's some so on and so forth and some others. So a question is, if this is so great, how come my doctor ain't doing it? And the answer is, well, it exceeds the standard of care, which basically means that it's what the rest of the herd is doing. And Peggy Watson is a really well-known medical doc, said that, a quote from her, strong economic forces led to the abandonment of true science, and doctors routinely prescribe meds due to apparent expert consensus, which is often self-appointed and largely in the pockets of the drug companies. Wow. And that is true. So it's time we looked at all aspects of the current best science available for risk reduction, not just inadequate and outdated standards of care. So early intervention in the form of lifestyle changes, diet, and targeted nutrients can decrease the risk of a lifetime of expensive toxic drugs and cardiac procedures. I hope you guys have gotten that clear. Class number 2, we're going to explore some other tools for lowering cardiovascular risk and promoting health. And this life-saving information should be shared with all those that you care about. Feel free to review this as often as you need to. I know it was a lot of technical information, but it's kind of hard to jam all this cardiovascular stuff into a small webinar. But I do hope you have enjoyed it, and I wish you all the best of health.